Before I open the floor for discussion, let me ask the panelists of this session to react to the other panelists' presentations or to make comments. I will do that in the same order as the panelists spoke. The first word goes to Mr. Anušauskas. Thank you. Yes, indeed. I do have something to say. I'd like to address the president of the Platform on European Memory and Conscience on Archives. We know all about the Russian archives. We know where they are, and we know which ones provide open access or partial access and which provide no access at all. The access to archives before 1940 is open. The access to archives from 1940 to 1960 are partially closed. Completely closed are archives of all NKVD departments. It is a military archive. I had been there. I saw the descriptions of documents they have there. Can we imagine in Europe a situation where SS battle group documents are unavailable to researchers? No, we can't. In Russia, this is the case. And this has been legislated in Russia. I think that selective attitude to the past is demonstrated by the selective attitude to the access and provision of access to researchers to archives. The military archives of Russia have the documents of 1948. This is the plan of the Great Wave of Deportation, including a huge map. It's still a secret document, and there are some secret data there. Classified data, I mean. What's important is not the contents, but the fact that everyone can see this map so that everyone can know how the war against nations was planned to be waged. It was not a war based on social factors. It was just a genocide crime. The crime had clear features of genocide. These crimes were directed against nations. Russia doesn't want to demonstrate that. Access to researchers is closed. And I'm thinking that Russia's position, once it changes, we will be able to talk with Russia on equal footage. So far, Russian researchers have free access to all archives in Lithuania. All Lithuanian archives are open. Whereas Lithuanian researchers find huge difficulties to access Russian archives. During the Lithuanian presidency of the Council of the EU, before the presidency and after the presidency, Lithuania will always have things to say on this problem. When it talks on behalf of the European Union and when it talks on its own behalf. This is a problem which we need to tackle. The memory and the past, whose victims in Lithuania were hundreds of thousands of people, has the right to be disclosed. Archives should be opened. Thank you. I'd like to welcome Professor Dumčius, who has just joined us. He is one of the participants of resistance and the head of the commission which works with the people who suffered from occupation. Let me now give the floor to Mr. Lindblad so that he can react to what we adopted in Berlin, the archives and access to archives, as well as the openness of archives in post-Soviet countries is of key importance.
I would say that Lithuania, together with the Czech Republic, are the #1 when it comes to opening all the archives and giving possibility for each and everyone, wherever country or whoever they are, to have access to the archives. This is utterly important that we do find out who did what. There are, for example, things coming out from the Stasi archives in Germany about informers. We had a minister in the Swedish church, a German. He informed on Swedes and countrymen in Sweden for some 35 years, and he was now finally exposed. This is important that this comes out in the open. So I agree totally. We cannot agree more than that. The archives are very essential. And therefore, because of the political situation in some member countries, it is important that we do have a legislation that guarantees the archives to be open for a long period of time. We have had changes of government in the Czech Republic and in Slovenia, and there have been attempts to try to close down parts of the archives. In Bulgaria is the worst of cases because they have a committee, Komdos, that's appointed by parliament, but the majority of the committee are old collaborators. The chairman has been with the security police, and they are now deciding who will have access to the archives and what documents should be accessible. And this is absolutely unacceptable. The platform has, of course, protested, but we all must put pressure on Bulgaria in order to change this and open up. I think they only have also 5 tables, 5 computers in the room where you can check the files, and everyone can understand that's not enough if you want to research an archive for all the work of the secret police in a whole country.
Thank you. I think Markas Zingeris will have his comments as well. And as a moderator, I'd like to focus your attention on the fact that Mr. Zingeris, Markas Zingeris, was right in highlighting the fact that denial and undermining of Holocaust was in place during the Soviet times, where the real racist and anti-Semitic nature and genocidal nature of the crime was masked. This was presented as the fight of the classes and as the killings of the innocent Soviet inhabitants. Thank you. I have a comment on the speech of Mr. Anušauskas. I agree with him completely. Even so, I would like to highlight an additional aspect. We can agree or disagree with the policy of Moscow. However, it's of huge importance to relate with Russian historians. As far as I know, one of the members of the commission in its renewed capacity is Yuri Afanasyev, member of the Russian academic community and a representative of the dissident movement. Even during the darkest years of communism rule, manuscripts from Russia, including the report of Khrushchev, which denounced the communist regime, went to the West thanks to personal contacts and became publicly known. Even classified materials, some of them were received in the West. This is why live contacts with historians in Russia with integrity is of huge importance for Lithuania. There's a distinction to be made between the Russian government and the Russian society in this respect. Mr. Anušauskas has a comment. Yes, I agree with you. Even if Russian, I wouldn't have even accessed the archives that are open unless my Russian colleagues would have helped me. The colleagues from the memorial organization helped me to overcome the many obstacles that I acquainted. There are many Russian researchers who look into the crimes of communism. A number of important books have been published on the gulags and repression structures before 1960. Huge academic publications have been published. We have human contacts, we have people-to-people contacts, and I think that our interest is, and their interest is, to open the archives as well. Mr. Emanuelis Zingeris. My speech will concern the Martynov, and he was a dissident, and there was his case which was investigated. Do you remember the story with the umbrella and the killings in the London metro by Bulgarian special services after the Stalinist regime, after the Stalin period? However, military criminals should be interrogated and tried regardless of the time when the crime was committed. Criminals associated with secret services in Warsaw Pact countries and Baltic countries should be also tried regardless of the time when the crime was committed. We addressed this appeal to the European Council, to the Council of the European Union. We will come back to that issue in the political context of the European Parliament and the Council. As far as Holocaust is concerned, millions of Jews are non-existent as a political factor in Europe. The electoral constituencies no longer exist, and they are buried and died. They don't take part in the daily lives of political parties, even though they did so before the war. This is why I believe that the Lithuanian Polish political elites and political elites in other countries should make a stance on the political dimension of the Jews, which were of huge importance before the World War II. So the political elites should commemorate the political memory of these Jews who had been killed during the Holocaust. How do we do that? The heritage, the cultural heritage of European Jews and the political heritage of politically active Jews should be commemorated in the Baltic countries, in Czech Republic, in Poland. We have posters of Zionist parties and other parties dating back to 1926. They were made available in an exhibition in the Seimas. There were Seimas protocols written in Yiddish. The Seimas Chronicle was printed in Yiddish. And we should make this heritage known to all. I think that my colleagues will support me in this. Thank you. Thank you, Emanuelis. I see Mr. Lauren willing to join the debate.
Let me say that I believe that the 23rd of August, the day of the signing of the so-called Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, or the Stalin-Hitler Pact, is a good date to have a commemoration of the common heritage of the two evil dictatorships in Europe. Because without that signature, Hitler couldn't have gone on in the speed and the way he did, especially with the Jewish population here and in Poland and the occupied territories. And Stalin couldn't then have gone on with his business on his side of this Molotov-Ribbentrop borderline. So there is a movement that has started to commemorate all the victims on the 23rd of August, because in order to have a common historical memory, we need symbolic dates. We have the date in January remembering the Holocaust, which is great, and we should do that. But we need a few more events in order to keep the public memory alive. I think that's very important. And let me also mention, I forgot that in my presentation, the platform has a traveling exhibition that will be here in Vilnius sometime during your chairmanship, I know. The traveling exhibition focused mainly on those countries that have double occupation, that suffered under both regimes. It's very simple exhibition. It's posters with pictures of perpetrators and numbers and examples of victims. One poster for each regime for those countries. Also, a few other countries that were not doubly occupied have joined in, but they only have one regime, of course. But this is easy, and then you don't have to compare the crimes between the totalitarian systems, but you can just judge each separately, and that is very good. And finally, to the comment on this Bulgarian killing, it's a bad habit of secret services to run around and kill people they don't like, and very many of us have difficulty. Our bodies don't like polonium, so we probably have to watch out.
Ačiū.
Thank you. We open the discussion for all the participants of the conference. Microphones are available in front of you. Please present yourselves before you start talking, because this conference is being recorded, and the recording will be available online. Please be concise and constructive. I have a question to Mr. Lindblad. My name is Algirdas Andriukaitis. I take part in the working group of organizations of resistance to occupation. In 1945, 130 Latvian, 9 Lithuanian and 7 Estonian troops ran away to Sweden from the respective countries. However, on the 23rd of January, they were sent to Stalin by a ship. The King of Sweden wrote a letter to Stalin, but this didn't help much. These people starved before going to Soviet Russia, and I have a question. Are these persons known in Sweden publicly? Are the persons who agreed with Stalin known? And how, in practice, did you commemorate the victims? Are the archives of this operation made public, and public access is ensured to them? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sweden is not a good example when it comes to being glorious or heroic. Sweden gave way for Hitler to transport troops on leave from Norway through our country during the Second World War, and Sweden sent back a lot of refugees, not only from Lithuania but also from Latvia and Estonia, and this is not proud moments at all in our history. The government have publicly said we're terribly sorry and it was wrongdoing when it comes to returning the refugees. But I don't think enough has been done, and my country is also not a good example when it comes to open all archives from that period. Some archives are open. There are not very many days for commemoration when it comes to the crimes of totalitarian communism. We do have commemoration regarding the Holocaust, which is good, and that should be done a lot, but there is almost nothing about the communism. And this is the same thing in many Western European countries. You can only speculate about the reason, but I think there are one reason is that there were collaborators, people in all political parties that did collaborate with Soviet Russia, actually. That's one reason. The other reason is ideological relatives between democratic socialism and communism. They have the same godfather in Marx, and the democratic socialists we cannot make them admit that Marx was actually wrong in everything, almost everything. Maybe he was right when it comes to that religion is bad for people, but that's a totally different discussion. And these are two reasons, and the third reason may be economical, because a lot of Western democracies are doing a lot of business with communist China and are doing business with Russia that have not dealt with the past enough. That was a long answer to a very short question, I'm sorry.
Vytautas Bruveris, Lietuvos ryto žurnalistas.
My name is Vytautas Bruveris. I am journalist of the Lithuanian daily Lietuvos Rytas. Good morning. I have a question to, first of all, Markas Zingeris and Mr. Anušauskas. I'm concerned about one subject which you could read between the lines in your speeches, which is the concept of genocide. Some keynote speakers have highlighted that Holocaust, in their opinion and the opinion of the Commission, was a unique crime against humanity and unique genocide. Mr. Anušauskas, in his last comment, mentioned that the Soviet Union crimes were crimes against nations, first of all, which had elementary features of genocide. My question is as follows. It's clear that one of the key reasons for the lack of consensus between the East and the West in Europe is the definition of the concept of genocide and the use of this definition. In Lithuania, the understanding of genocide is a wider one. The intent to exterminate the social, political, religious, or national group is considered genocide in Lithuania. Don't you think that debate at the international and local level should be renewed on the concept of genocide and the use of this concept? Do you think this should be done, and in which direction should we go? Should Lithuania pressurize the Western partners so that they recognize our definition of genocide, or should we, in Eastern Europe, go a step back and accept the concept and use of the genocide as it is used in the West? Yes, Vytautas, you are a competent journalist and you made a very good observation. In the West, genetic and ethnic principle is the basis for killings in the definition of genocide. In my opinion, what we have here are several issues. Let me go deeper into history. The concept of genocide as a feature of modern jurisdiction was proposed by a lawyer from Belgium to the United Nations, to the Commission of United Nations, on the basis of his experience and professional competence. He was the originator, and this is how this concept was implemented. The definition was quite wide. I'm not a lawyer, but I remember it says something about the killings on the basis of ethnicity and genes, as well as the extermination of social groups. So there is some space for interpretation. On the basis of this definition, we could work out. I think that the Soviet rhetoric was more faulty, because racists clearly said what they did, and there was more hypocrisy in the Soviet regime. The racial groups were modified by, and the right to live in this world was based on the pertinence to the group in under Nazi regime. This is why we speak about the uniqueness of Holocaust. The Soviet rhetoric was hypocritical. They said one thing and they did something else. Officially, the Soviet actions and the actions and mission of the state were oriented towards the class theory, and the ideology was based on the combat between two classes. some classes were more progressive, the proletariat, I mean, and the intellectuals were less valuable. This is what Soviet policy was based on. Mr. Anušauskas will support me because he officially looked into the Soviet policy and other issues. Even regardless of what I said, the Crimea Tatars in the Soviet Union, for collaboration with the Nazi regime and for other crimes, were treated as criminal. They were deported as a result from the Caucasus. Ingush and Chechen people were deported as well, and this is the principle of collective responsibility. Even though this is not officially declared, the official ideology spoke about the combat between classes, but in practice, entire ethnic groups were treated under the collective responsibility clause, which can be seen as a feature of genocide if these groups are exterminated. It's quite complex matter. Lithuania, the Baltic countries, and former Soviet satellites care about it. This is why these countries could initiate international level forums where legal historians and lawyers as well as historians cover the issues related to genocide concept. In Cambodia, Pol Pot rule was based on genocide policy, and huge numbers of people in Cambodia were killed just because their views were not in line with the views of the provincial heads. These issues could be debated in international fora. Is the modern definition of genocide effective enough? And could we use the same definition for processes which took place in the 20th century? Mr. Anušauskas.
Well, I have to say that in Moscow, in those closed archives that I mentioned before, there are documents witnessing the treatment not according to the classical viewpoint, but rather according to the national base. I have seen this document. I couldn't copy it, but I still read it. It's a document of the interior, a list of untrustworthy nations, what the Caucasus nations were doing there. There is no question about it. But what about Ukrainians, Latvians, Estonians, and Lithuanians? There were no more nations mentioned there. There was no mention about different imprisonment conditions, let's say for Germans, Russians, Vlasov, supporters, or other categories. There was nothing about that. There was nothing mentioned about, let's say, specific conditions for people transported from Lithuania who were accused of being farmers. The notice was very simple: to apply different imprisonment conditions to the following nations. That's all. One more remark. The question about 137 Latvians and a few Lithuanians and Estonians who were returned to NKVD headquarters right after the Second World War. I would like to remind all of you that the Prime Minister of Sweden back in 1940, when making his statement in July about improvement of the Soviet Union's right. And the second issue regarding return of Balts to the Soviet Union made a separate statement. I would suggest that you all read the statement because it was made 2 years ago on the 15th of August. That contained a critical evaluation of Swedish attitude of that time. I would like to add on my own behalf to the discussion about genocide and its concept by reminding the participants of the conference that in the Western world there is the so-called conventional concept of genocide that was approved in the United Nations back in 1948. And Marcus was right by saying that the concept of genocide was introduced by a Polish Jew, Raphael Lemkin, who survived genocide. There were both social and political groups, indeed, and in the first documents of the United Nations also contained these concepts linked to genocide, and it was only right before voting. It's evidenced by these documents, which showed that due to the Soviet Union and its satellites, that these social and political groups were taken out from the definition. Probably it can be justified if we remember the realities of that time after the Second World War, when concessions used to be made for the Soviet Union and its satellite countries. But raising some victims against the others is unacceptable in today's world. Certainly, we can discuss the concept of genocide, expanding this concept, but the most important is that we have the moral starting point in our minds. Because every victim, every manslaughter is a huge crime, and the memory about all of them is very important. As I don't see any hands raised, I would like to give the floor to Vytautas Bruveris once again. Just to clarify the answer, whether it's yes or no. So, in your opinion, Lithuania should stick to the position, to the opinion that the crimes of Soviet regimes in Lithuania are to be called genocide. Well, I haven't said that. It's your interpretation. What I was saying was that there are documents evidencing that the people who, due to various reasons, were repressed, deported, and killed, were treated on the basis of their nationality, not other factors. How Lithuania should behave with respect to concrete investigations and research depends on many circumstances, probably also looking into the character of the crime itself, because we can't treat all of them uniformly. I can just add here that there is another danger. Sometimes we come across the fact that the concept of genocide loses its value. The processes have to take place in parallel. On one hand, the lawyers have to agree how this concept can be applied in modern world where a lot of similar things are going on, and with respect, on the other hand, with respect to the past events. It has to be thoroughly discussed. As far as the Soviet aggression is concerned, I agree with Mr. Anušauskas because the motives and the reasons were really diverse. In some cases, the propagandic identity were applied to one or another nation, whereas in other cases people were deported quite on other grounds. I have one question, if I may. We still have a few participants of the panel, so please.
Against humanity, because that's an easier definition to use, and it can be applied to any regime, actually, if we use the term crime against humanity, and if we take the standpoint from the individual view that it's a breach of basic human rights.
Aš noriu pasakyti, kad tai šiandien susirinkimas mūsų.
Well, I see some prominent historians among us, Mr. Sužiedėlis, Mr. Nikžentaitis, and others, Mr. Šarūnas. What I would like to tell you is that we have reports about unique features of Holocaust and other points. In Lemkin's time, there were a number of countries representing the commission, Lemkin's commission. The configuration that won against Hitler and their influence, but in our conclusions, the uniqueness of Holocaust was based, among other international things. And to answer my friend Bruver, the conclusions of the commission may serve as the answer. Whereas in the Lithuanian media, Lithuanian press, it is quite common to talk about, let's say, poor conditions, genocide against Lithuanian policemen or pensioners. We have nothing to do with this concept, and we would never use this word, genocide, without responsibility. Jūratė Litūnaitė, history teacher. While working in school, I often come across the use of concepts, and school pupils wish to use these concepts precisely. So speaking about the concept of genocide and crimes against humanity, a big problem is to make pupils understand what the human being is. I looked through many international documents looking into the concept of the human being so that I could develop into the crimes against humanity and other concepts. It is not the first concept where I hear about totalitarianism, where Khrushchev and Brezhnev's times are not usually mentioned, where crimes against human dignity, freedom, expression mentioned. And today, when I was listening about totalitarianism, crimes, why we give so little attention to other freedoms and rights. Let's say in Khrushchev's times. Thank you for a very useful observation. Yes, we fully agree with you. What we do today is focus on most brutal crimes, but it goes without saying that we are not trying to ignore less brutal, less evident crimes, crimes against persons' rights and freedoms. And 1 year ago, we had a similar conference in this hall about the Soviet times after 1950, which is treated like a normal development period, sometimes both in Lithuania and other countries. Therefore, we should necessarily have a broader outlook into these crimes. Mr. Joran has said.
Also that we have to deal with the crimes committed by all totalitarian regimes all the time. And that means until the fall of the regime. 89 in the case of communism in many countries, 91 in some, and of course with the National Socialistic regime, it's the fall of Hitler Germany. But it is important that we deal with what happened after Stalin, definitely, and I didn't mean to overlook that. It's just, as Ronaldo says, we focus on the worst crimes when we discuss. But last week, as we visited this Stasi prison, we could learn that in East Germany, they had prisoners tortured until the very end of the regime. And people were shot at the borders, and the man who guided me around in the prison, he had been in prison himself 3 times. First time when he was 18, and the last time not long before the fall of the wall. And he told about methods of water torture and other intimidation within the prison, and also outside. He told us that all his posts had been opened, always, for 30 years, all posts, and all his telephone calls had been listened into. And he could read about that in his own files in the archive. So the regimes were terrible until the very end. They collected data, they terrorized people, and they used intimidation. And these types of regimes, they use intimidation even today, and they try to intimidate even us sometimes, not very successfully, but I had a Vietnamese communist calling me about 3 o'clock in the morning for several months, almost a year. I almost miss him. I have his name in the telephone under the name, just because we had made a statement as parliamentarians traveling to Vietnam about the bad idea to imprison some opposition. And then they called and called. So intimidation is a way of the totalitarian regimes, successful too many times, unfortunately.
Dar nori Markas repliką ir Emanuelis.
A remark by Emanuelis, Marcus, and then we'll finish our session. We are happy that people get involved in the discussions, and you will be able to raise similar questions, the same questions, when we have more time for the discussion later. Now, Marcus and Emanuelis, please. What I want to mention is that other forms of terror, psychological terror, and life in fear is, let's say, crimes which are more difficult to document, because regarding mass executions, we usually have reports. This is why it is easier to identify them. However, we have this task, and we have to base it mainly on the memories of witnesses as well as pieces of art, works of art. We have some excellent examples of pieces of art picturing those crimes. There are also files of interrogation reflecting the atmosphere. For instance, Latzman, a Jewish poet, was arrested in Vilnius back in 1952. There is a file in the special archives, likewise other important files, and there are complaints, 13 complaints about his activity in negatively speaking about the Soviet Union authorities. Well, in fact, this person was just making some noise in the Writers' Union building because he was pushed out from the Writers' Union and he didn't have any revenues. What he did in prison was the refusal to eat, and even though it sounds strange, after his release he was issued a passport, and his protests really helped him a lot. So we can find separate fragments regarding persecution of people in various files. Maybe we can invite our pupils and students, giving them a social context, and put more creative efforts into all this. Thank you. The question was really important, related to other crimes, not only those related to murder, because change of mentality is also a crime. And I believe that 10 new European Union member states hope that old member states will perceive why they are lagging behind the others within the European Union, when all the potential was taken away from them and all the possibilities were eliminated to create their potential. How will the Central Europe look today if it hadn't been occupied by communists, let's say in the 21st century? So such assessment and the loss of mentality by brutally destroying representatives of the then free market, let's say in Hungary, the Czech Republic, by not allowing them to communicate with their friends and family members in the West, eliminating the possibility to speak freely and to express themselves, meant huge losses indeed. When the Eastern Europe was artificially put into the frames of the communists, the answer is, of course, yes. These crimes have to be investigated thoroughly, including the change of mentality. I'm very sorry to mention that here I could refer to the consequences of the elections of our recent elections to the parliament here in Lithuania. So the deep aspect of this issue is related to all the possible consequences. Well, the denial of Holocaust is not only used in this part of the world. For instance, Iran denies Holocaust as well and believes that Israel has to be destroyed altogether. We have to join forces and to stop the process of denying Holocaust. Or if we look at the Belarus, the sculptures of Grutas Park, exhibited in our Grutas Park, are still standing in the center of Minsk. People are tortured by KGB in Belarus. The same building where it used to be. People are asked questions with their connections with the European Parliament members. Even these days, under Dzerzhinsky portrait. Doesn't it mean a continuation of the Soviet policy? Well, I would like to thank all the participants of the session. I know that there are more people willing to ask, but we have already lagged behind our schedule. We will have time for discussions. Now let's have 45 minutes lunch break. We come again at 1:30. And thank you. I would like to thank the interpreters.